age of 18, Johann Friedrich Böttger was blessed with a strong pair of legs, which came in handy for his chosen profession, that of alchemy. Now, earning a living by attracting sponsors to support you in your quest to transmute base metals into gold doesn't come without its risks, chief amongst which is the anger of those disappointed patrons who might, on discovering what's actually been going on, run you out of town, or worse, hunt you down, fling you in the jail and throw away the key. Which is why, in 1704, young Johann was running as fast as his legs would carry him, heading southeast along the banks of the River Elbe, away from some rather angry Berlin sponsors and towards the city of Dresden, hoping to find at least some peace and quiet and possibly a new patron. Well, his wish was granted, but not quite on the terms he'd have hoped for. He was taken into protective custody by Augustus the Strong, Elector of Saxony, King of Poland, and, as the name suggests, not someone to trifle with. Johann was confined to a laboratory under instructions to produce gold in order to help pay for Augustus's expensive lifestyle. Something of a challenge, since like many of his contemporary alchemists, Johann wasn't actually making much progress in that direction. Now, the world of innovation is full of the names of famous partnerships. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, Bill Hewitt and David Packard, Sergey Brin, Larry Page, to name but a few. But Böttger and von Schirnhaus isn't a combination which springs easily to the lips or off the tongue. Yet it was this unlikely partnership which managed the impossible, because between them they were able to transmute base material into weißes Gold, white gold. Now, Ehrenfried Walter von Schirnhaus was a much older man than Johann. He was a chemist in the town of Meissen who'd worked all his life to try and improve glass making. But as a sideline, he was interested in ceramics, in particular trying to work out how to make porcelain. Now, he'd heard of Johann's plight and saw an opportunity. He persuaded Augustus to assign Johann to work with him on the quest, and in 1705 Böttger, still under guard, was moved to Meissen to work with Schirnhaus. Now, why would he do that? Well, mainly because he understood that Augustus had an obsession with porcelain. So much so that in order to add to his collection, he presented 600 cavalrymen from his army, complete with horses, to the Prussian king Frederick Wilhelm I in the spring of 1717. In exchange, he received 151 Chinese porcelain vessels. This wasn't a foolish obsession. At that time, porcelain was prized highly among the aristocracy. It was worth its weight in gold. Pale, thin, translucent, its delicate texture worked into wonderful and complex shapes. And above all, it was rare. The only supplies came from China via the Silk Road, and merchants were able to charge extraordinary prices for this strange, exotic, oriental material. They embellished the legend surrounding the stuff, that it all came from one mysterious location, Jingdezheng, in the centre of China, specifically from a hill which housed the mine from which the porcelain emerged as if by magic. Truth was, merchants didn't know much about it, and neither did the Chinese who supplied them. Marco Polo's best guess at its origins? He said, the dishes are made of a crumbly earth or clay which is dug as though from a mine and stacked in huge mounds and left for 30 or 40 years exposed to wind, rain and sun. By this time the earth is so refined that dishes made of it are of an azure tint with a very brilliant sheen. The assumption that this was somehow magical can be seen in an account from 1550 which suggested that Porcelain is made of a certain juice which coalesces underground. Its origins didn't matter. Its rarity meant it was immensely valuable. So, if anyone could find a way to make porcelain, they would also make their fortune. An interesting business proposition which convinced Augustus to allow Böttger, under von Schirnshaus's supervision, to start work. Now theirs was not an overnight success. Their work was interrupted for a year when the Swedish army occupied Saxony in 1706, and Böttger was moved to a distant fortress for safekeeping. And their progress wasn't a matter of luck or sudden flashes of inspiration. It was about turning fragments of knowledge wrapped up in superstition and half-truth, turning that into something reproducible, codifiable, and manageable. It was a kind of transmutation, but of ideas, not metals. They kept at the project, bringing a discipline to their experiments and painstakingly recording their successes, few of them, and their failures, many of them, on the way to synthesizing this material. Von Schirnhaus died on October 11th, 1708 from dysentery, but he had the opportunity to see his life's work come to fruition, because that year they found a reliable and practical formula and developed a manufacturing process to convert handfuls of earth into white gold, porcelain. By 1709, Böttger's laboratories in the Albrechtsburg fortress in Meissen began producing batches of porcelain, and the first pieces went on sale at the Leipzig Easter Fair in 1710. Augustus finished building a royal porcelain factory in Meissen in June the same year and transferred all the operation there. Their first products were red. There are in fact a few examples still around now, mostly known as Böttger stoneware. But soon Böttger's continued experimentation enabled him, in 1713, to make a pale white version, and then to use different coloured glazes to enable the creation of beautiful and functional porcelain china wares. Which is where another important piece of the puzzle comes in. Because rather than develop production on a large scale to make porcelain a commodity, Böttger, with Augustus's backing and using the profits from early sales, began to add design into the mix. He commissioned artists to create a range of exquisite artifacts, exploiting the potential of this new material and opening up a wealthy market niche to continue to fund his development work. Meissen porcelain figures were used to decorate the drawing rooms of great houses. Sculptures took pride of place in entrance halls, and even the most mundane business of eating and drinking became a pleasure when using beautifully crafted plates, cups, pots and jugs. What Böttger did was essentially create what these days we would call experience innovation. The Germans weren't alone. While the boys were busy in Meissen, beavering away at their version of porcelain, a French Jesuit father, Père d'Entrecol, was moonlighting as a spy, working in the porcelain factories of Jingdezhen in China. And in 1712, he published a detailed account of Chinese porcelain production. And pretty soon, there was a factory in France, at the city of St. Cloud, making soft-paste porcelain. This wasn't as strong as the Chinese or Meissen versions, but it found a market. The company grew into what became the Sèvres brand, which is still around today. Everybody wanted to be in on the act. In 1744, Elizabeth of Russia joined the club, signing an agreement to establish the first porcelain factory there. Dmitry Ivanovich Vinogradov carried out his own painstaking research, and by 1760 had helped the Imperial Porcelain Factory in St. Petersburg to become another major centre. Now, faced with the challenge of increasing imitation, Augustus's team set about differentiating themselves in other ways. They built a brand, building on the relationships they'd already made and the values that they and their products stood for: purity, exquisite design, high quality at a premium price. And to make sure they got the message across, they employed a trademark, the crossed swords of the Meissen brand, which can be still found on their wares today, 300 years later. European porcelain had arrived, and just in time to catch another wave of change which fueled its popularity and kept it a very profitable industry. In the early 18th century, the growing middle classes discovered the attraction of exotic drinks, tea, coffee and chocolate, and their popularity swept across the continent. It wasn't just the drinks themselves, it was the social experience which surrounded them. But it also drove a practical revolution in both drawing rooms and later coffee shops. A premium priced drink needs a suitable vessel from which to drink it, not just a simple cup. And the trouble with using gold or silver or expensive metal cups from which to drink it is that it's not very practical. They get hot and they burn your lips. That's where fine china, exemplified by that thin, translucent porcelain, comes into its own. The perfect material from which to construct cups, pots, milk jugs, and all the other accoutrements of the tea or coffee service. Pretty soon, everybody wanted one. And just like today, when the advanced and expensive features in something like a motor car begin with the luxury product targeted at the wealthy customer and then trickle down to the mainstream mass market. So, porcelain moved from being a luxury item to one consumed on a far bigger scale. Helped along by the growing industrialization of its manufacture and the strong scientific underpinning to those factories. Now, open innovation isn't a new phenomenon. Innovation's always been about knowledge flows. Taking ideas from one source and adapting and redeploying them, it's a key feature of the way the game plays out. Böttcher and von Schirnhaus themselves borrowed plenty of ideas from their Chinese counterparts, and their knowledge base around porcelain was partly constructed of whatever they could find out about how the Chinese did it. But while it's good to draw on knowledge from other people, open innovation raises the risk that your own hard-won knowledge leaks out. And despite taking precautions to protect their intellectual property, the potential value of porcelain in the marketplace spawned many attempts to steal their ideas. It helped them, of course, that their R&D facility, their research laboratory, was located inside a castle, the Albrechtsburg Fortress, with high physical walls to prevent things leaking out. But even those walls could be breached. In today's terms, we'd talk perhaps of a rather weak appropriability regime. In other words, it was hard to keep the lid on what was going on. And a man called Samuel Stölzel was a senior alchemist at Meissen, one of the few who understood the secrets, the arcana, of making the hard porcelain for which the company had become famous. For a suitably high price, he was persuaded to sell these to a competing venture, which in 1717 started to produce porcelain in Vienna. Now, by 1760, there were over 30 porcelain factories in Europe and 50 by the end of that decade. But despite the explosion in demand and the growth in factories with the technical expertise to produce porcelain, there was one major bottleneck to its widespread diffusion. High-quality china clay, kaolin, is the primary raw material, and most of this still came from the Far East. Now, this helped the early British entry into the field, since it had, through the East India Company, the capability to import huge quantities direct from China. So in Britain, the first attempts at porcelain were made around 1742, demonstrated by Thomas Briand to the members of the Royal Society, using the French St. Cloud soft paste process. By 1749, Thomas Fry had experimented with adding bone ash to create a harder version, and that's something that became known as bone china. His patent was used by Josiah Spode to refine the process and begin the business which still bears his name. But the big breakthrough came through the efforts of one William Cookworthy, an apothecary who in his walks discovered huge deposits of china clay at Tregonning Hill in Cornwall. This material was known locally as moorstone, and Cookworthy found a way to separate the material using water to remove the impurities and let it settle out. And then he spent another 20 years developing his own recipe for making porcelain, which he successfully patented in 1768. He immediately established the Plymouth Porcelain Factory and began making fine china using kaolin and china stone to make the hard paste porcelain with a body composition similar to that of the Chinese porcelains of the early 18th century. And it wasn't long before big names like Wedgwood and Spode began producing their own versions of porcelain artifacts, exporting them all around the world. Now, the Cornish deposits were the largest known to the world, and by the middle of the 19th century, 65,000 tons of china clay were being mined every year in the St Austell area of Cornwall. 7,000 workers fed an industry. Tiny villages were quickly upgraded and developed to cater for this massively growing industry. One of the villages, a place called West Polmere, had a pre-china clay industry population of 9. It was thoroughly transformed, however, by the entrepreneur and landowner Charles Rashley. And what he did was not just work on the clay itself, but also invest a huge amount of money converting that small village into a safe harbour for ships and a location for factories. This place, which is now called Charlestown, soon had a population of 3,000 and a dock packed with ships and with warehouses, with boat builders, rope menders, brickworks, lime burners, all sorts of trades growing up around this china clay industry. By 1910, Cornwall was producing around 50% of the world's china clay, something in the region of 1 million tons every year, most of which, 75%, was exported. But nothing lasts forever. The bulk of today's kaolin actually comes from Brazil, not from the UK, although there are still a few clay pits working in the UK, mostly targeted at specialist markets as disparate as toothpaste, electrical insulators, dental fixtures and paint. Porcelain still has a lot going for it. But even though there are only a handful of people working in those few surviving clay pits, there's plenty of visitors to the Cornish countryside around St Austell. Only these days what's drawing them is a reinvented version of the clay industry. Back around the turn of that 20th century there wasn't much to encourage tourism, quite the reverse in fact. The area for miles around looked like a lunar landscape, pockmarked with great white craters filled with rock and spoil, small mountains of discarded earth thrown up in the quest for the white gold buried below. Certainly not something you'd want to come and visit and take a look at. But a mixture of increasing regulation, which was forcing manufacturers to restore the land by careful landscaping, and Mother Nature throwing her shoulder to the wheel, has recreated a kind of green moorland once again. And in one such valley near to St Austell, a different kind of history is being celebrated. The Eden Project is now home to a series of giant biospheres, huge transparent domes which house a variety of different ecologies, showing off different environments from right across planet Earth and providing a rich educational experience. It's become a multi-award-winning tourist attraction, nestling in the landscape created by those gold diggers of a bygone age. Now, what does this story tell us about innovation? Perhaps the most significant lesson is success isn't a matter of luck. There wasn't a single eureka moment. It was rather a long and systematic search. Unlike that mystical dream of the alchemists of turning base metal into gold, this industry, converting earth into white gold, this porcelain industry was founded on the growing scientific premise that it would be possible to make porcelain and do so under controlled conditions. And it would be possible to learn how to repeat that trick and to codify the knowledge for doing so. So in many ways, what Bottger and von Schirnhaus did was lay the foundations for the systematic industrial research and development which grew to underpin the great chemical industries of Europe in things like dyestuffs, fertilizers, soap, pharmaceuticals, and explosives. Patient money helps, and having a wealthy benefactor isn't a bad start for any entrepreneurial venture. But the growth of Meissen porcelain wasn't simply a case of pouring in money. The continuing investment of time and resources wasn't just blind faith on Augustus's part. It was based on a recognition of the potential market opportunity. There was in the short term a demand pull for the luxury item that porcelain represented, but in order to feed that, the company needed to grow their niche. And a key part of that story was design. Not simply providing functional domestic wear, but creating works of art which reinforced the perception of something precious, something to be desired and treasured. But building a business out of an idea and moving to scale needs a system. Inside it, there are many pieces of the jigsaw puzzle to be put in place. So as well as commissioning designers to imagine the products, the Meissen team also had to continue their hard work on the process technology to be able to manufacture them. All the different stages like moulding and shaping, painting, glazing, firing, all of those needed to move from manual operations to controlled, systematic, reproducible processes. And beyond that, there were challenges in scaling around procuring the raw materials of the right quality, especially the kaolin, and downstream the development of sales and distribution networks. It's a huge industry today, but it didn't happen by accident. Was it worth it? Well, for Bottger, our young Johann who was running away from a lot of trouble in Berlin, it was a way of surviving, even if he did spend much of the rest of his life under house arrest. Augustus finally granted him his freedom in 1714, so he was able to spend the final years of his life enjoying the sense of achievement that, having at least partially achieved that alchemist dream of transmuting base material into gold and helping create an industry. An industry which today continues to produce beautiful artifacts for widespread use around the world. The estimates for the ceramic tableware market size are getting on for $4 billion. Now that's not bad progress for an athletic runaway from Berlin.